What would you do if you were so broken, so lost, that you found yourself trying to rob a house of God? Imagine the feel of cold steel in your hand, a crowbar that feels heavier than it should. The air inside is thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the ghost of 1,000 whispered prayers. The only sound is the frantic beat of your own heart, a drum against the vast, listening silence. This is where desperation leads. It leads to a sacred place, in the dead of night, with a choice that can shatter a soul or save it. His name was Leo, and for the last 6 months, he had been a ghost in his own life. He lived in a third-floor walk-up in a tired brick building just west of the Russell Industrial Center in Detroit, Michigan. From his window, he saw only other tired brick buildings, their windows like vacant eyes staring back at him. The sky above was a permanent, unforgiving slate gray, the color of November in the city. His apartment was a collection of empty spaces. The cupboard held a half-empty box of saltines and a jar of instant coffee. The mailbox downstairs held only final notices with their stark red print. The other side of his bed held the permanent indentation of someone who was never coming back. Leo had been a line worker at the assembly plant, his hands shaped by the rhythm of machines and the weight of steel. Those hands were now soft and still, resting on a worn Formica tabletop, tracing the cracks as if they were maps to a different life. He spent his days walking. He'd walk east on Grand River Avenue, past the new condos that seemed to mock the decay around them, then cut down toward the Motor City Casino, its flashing lights a promise of luck he no longer believed in. He walked without destination, a man erased by the city that had once defined him. The noise of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of crowds he passed through, it all felt like it was happening behind a thick pane of glass. He was present in body, but his spirit was a hollowed-out thing, echoing with the silence left by unanswered prayers. He did not feel anger or sadness, or even despair. Those were active things, feelings that required energy he did not have. What he felt was a great crushing weight, a physical pressure in his chest that made each breath a conscious effort. He was a man disconnected from his own story, a character whose lines had been cut from the script. The city moved on, its steel and glass heart pumping with a life that had no room for him. He was just a man in a thin coat, walking against a cold wind, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement in front of him. The memories came not as gentle waves, but as jagged shards of glass. They found him in the quiet of his apartment, in the reflection of a storefront window, in the low hum of the streetlights switching on at dusk. He remembered the blinding white of the hospital corridors, the relentless, sterile scent of antiseptic that clung to his clothes for days. He spent weeks in a plastic chair in the waiting room of Detroit Receiving Hospital, the television in the corner always on, always ignored. He filled out forms on clipboards until his fingers cramped, each signature a small surrender, a chipping away of the life he and Maria had built. Maria. Her name was a phantom on his lips. He remembered her laughter, a sound that could fill their small apartment more than any furniture or decoration ever did. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the way she'd trace the lines on his palm after a long shift. Then he remembered her hand growing colder, the skin thin as paper. The diagnosis had been a blunt instrument, delivered by a doctor with tired eyes in a room painted a calming, useless shade of blue. The bills began to arrive, white envelopes filled with impossible numbers, each one a nail in the coffin of their future. He took extra shifts until there were no extra shifts to take. The plant announced layoffs, and his seniority wasn't enough. He sold her car, he sold his father's watch. He cashed in the small policy they'd bought years ago, thinking it was for a down payment on a house in the suburbs. It all went to the hospital, to the pharmacies, to the specialists. It was never enough. He prayed then. He'd knelt by her bedside, the beep of the machines a cruel metronome, and begged for a miracle. He promised anything, everything. The silence that answered him was colder and more vast than any winter night on the Detroit River. When she finally slipped away, It wasn't the grief that broke him. It was the silence. It was the stark, final evidence that he was utterly and completely alone. The emptiness in their apartment was no longer just a lack of her presence. It was an active, malevolent force. It was the sound of God not answering. The idea came to him on a Tuesday, born not of malice but of a profound and simple exhaustion. He was tired of being hungry. He was tired of being cold. He was tired of the silence. He'd heard stories growing up of old city churches, of silver chalices and brass candlesticks, of donation boxes filled by the faithful. It was a thought he pushed away at first, a flicker of shame in the back of his mind. But desperation is a patient predator. It waits until you are too weak to fight back. By nightfall, the thought had solidified into a plan, a single grim point of focus in the fog of his existence. At 2:17 a.m., Leo stood in the alley behind St. Joseph's Oratory on J Street, near the quiet edge of Eastern Market. The massive church, a neo-Gothic fortress of faith, was dark and silent, its spires reaching into the ink-black sky. He pulled the crowbar from under his coat. The metal was frigid against his skin. He found a small side door, old wood and iron, and set to work. The wood splintered with a sound like a breaking bone. The lock gave way with a low metallic groan. He slipped inside. The air was heavy, cool, and carried the scent of stone and frankincense. Moonlight filtered through the towering stained glass windows, threw fractured jewels of blue and red and gold across the pews and the marble floor. The silence in here was different from the silence in his apartment. This was a holy silence, a silence with weight and history. For a moment, he simply stood there, an intruder in a world he had long since abandoned. He moved toward the main altar, his worn boots making no sound on the stone. His eyes found the heavy oak donation box bolted to the floor near the communion rail. That was his target. He raised the crowbar, his muscles tense. The polished wood of the crucifix hanging high above the tabernacle seemed to catch a sliver of moonlight, the carved body of Christ a silhouette of suffering. In a back pew, a pile of coats and blankets shifted. A man, homeless and seeking shelter from the wind, let out a soft gasp, a sound of disturbed sleep. Leo froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. The man, whose name was Arthur, simply pulled the blanket higher and fell silent again, but the spell of the empty church was broken. Leo was not alone. Then it happened. It wasn't a voice that came through the air. It was a sound that bloomed inside his own skull, as clear and resonant as a struck bell, yet gentle. It was not a shout of judgment, not a roar of condemnation. It was a question, calm and filled with a sorrow that was not his own. "My son, what are you doing?" The words were not just heard. They were felt, a vibration that ran through every nerve in his body. The crowbar slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that echoed through the vast, silent sanctuary, a sound of sacrilege and surrender all at once. Leo stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He turned and fled, leaving the crowbar lying on the floor like an offering. He burst out of the side door into the biting November air, his lungs burning. He didn't run with a destination in mind, he just ran. He ran past the darkened warehouses of Eastern Market, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The question followed him, not as a sound but as a presence, a weight in his mind heavier than any guilt. He ran until his legs gave out, and he found himself leaning against the brick wall of a building on Russell Street, gasping for air that did not seem to fill his lungs. The sky was beginning to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple. He started walking again, his movements stiff and automatic. An hour later, he found himself on Lafayette Boulevard, drawn by the yellow glow of Lafayette Coney Island, a 24-hour beacon for the city's night owls and lost souls. He slid into a worn vinyl booth, the scent of grilled onions and coffee a strange comfort. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind face filled a thick ceramic mug with coffee and set it in front of him. He didn't have the money to pay for it. He just sat there, staring into the black liquid, his hands shaking around the mug's warmth. The clatter of plates, the sizzle of the grill, the low murmur of other customers, it was all a distant hum. The only thing that felt real was the echo of the question, a quiet, persistent ringing in the hollows of his soul. He had come looking for something to steal, and had instead been handed a question that would rob him of what little peace he had left. He returned to his apartment as the sun cast a weak, watery light over the city. The small room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in on him. He sat on the edge of his bed, the springs groaning in protest. He could still feel the cold of the church, smell the wax and incense on his clothes. He tried to reason it away. It was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by hunger and stress. He was exhausted. He was grieving. His brain had simply created a sound, a voice, out of his own guilt. But the explanation felt as hollow as he did. The voice had not felt like a part of him. It felt ancient, other. A tremor started in his hands, a fine, uncontrollable shaking he couldn't stop. He pressed his palms together, but the trembling continued, a physical manifestation of his shattered state. He felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar pressure that had now sharpened into a precise point of discomfort directly over his heart. He tried to eat one of the stale saltines, but his throat closed up. He couldn't swallow. He was a prisoner in his own body, besieged by a memory that would not fade. He got up and paced the small room from the window to the door, a caged animal. He looked at the framed photograph of Maria on his nightstand. Her smile, once a source of comfort, now felt like an accusation. He had failed her in life, and now he was failing her in death, becoming a person she would not have recognized. He had tried to rob a church. The thought was absurd, monstrous. It wasn't who he was. Or was it? Was this what was left of him when everything else was stripped away? The silence in the room was absolute, but his mind was screaming. That night, he couldn't stay in the apartment. The four walls were a tomb. An unseen force pulled him back out into the cold, back toward the church. He walked the 2 miles to St. Joseph's Oratory, not knowing why he was going, only that he had to. He didn't try the door this time. He just stood across the street, a shadow among shadows, and looked at it. The stone facade was dark, imposing, a sleeping giant in the heart of the city. He expected to feel nothing, to see nothing. He expected the cold and the silence to confirm that the voice had been a dream. Then, at precisely 3 a.m., it began. A single, clear note rang out from the bell tower. It wasn't the tinny, recorded chime he was used to hearing from modern churches. This was the deep, resonant toll of a massive bronze bell, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. It rang once, a powerful, solitary announcement in the dead of night, and then fell silent. As the last vibration faded, a light began to grow in the large, circular, stained glass window high on the church's facade. It wasn't the harsh white light of an electric bulb. It was a warm, golden luminescence, soft and alive, that pulsed gently, illuminating the image of the Sacred Heart at the window's center. Across J Street, a woman named Eleanor, kept awake by a nagging cough, glanced out her apartment window. She saw the light and frowned, thinking it was odd for the priests to be up at this hour. But the glow was unlike any light she had ever seen, and she stood watching, captivated, a witness in the night. A new sensation reached Leo, a scent, faint at first, then growing impossibly rich and clear. It was the fragrance of roses, a deep, heady perfume that had no place in the frozen, exhaust-fumed air of a Detroit November. It was the smell of a summer garden blooming in the heart of winter. He breathed it in, and the tightness in his chest, the cold knot of fear and failure, began to dissolve. The warmth from the light seemed to cross the street, to touch his skin, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in his marrow. The voice came again, inside his head, as clear as the bell, as warm as the light. It was not a question. It was a promise. You are not forgotten. The next morning, Leo walked back to the church. The great oak doors were open, propped for the early daily mass. He hesitated on the steps, feeling the eyes of the few elderly parishioners who were trickling in. He was unwashed, his clothes were wrinkled, he was an outcast. But the memory of the light, the scent of the roses, pulled him forward. He stepped inside, into the familiar cool and the scent of candle wax. He ignored the pews, ignored the altar boys lighting the candles. He walked down the center aisle, his steps echoing softly. He stopped at the very spot where he had dropped the crowbar. He looked up at the crucifix, at the carved face of the forgiving Christ. And then, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees. The cold of the marble seeped through the thin fabric of his pants. He didn't know the words to pray. He had forgotten them all, or perhaps he had never really known them, so he just knelt. He knelt in the silence, his head bowed, in an act of complete and total surrender. From the side of the altar, the parish priest, a man named Father Michael with silver hair and gentle eyes, watched him. He didn't recognize the man, but he recognized the posture. It was the posture of a soul that had come to the end of itself. He did not move, did not interrupt. He simply let the man be. After a long time, Leo rose. He felt lighter. The crushing weight on his chest was gone. He turned to leave, and his eye caught a crumpled fast food bag tucked under the edge of a pew. Without thinking, he stooped, picked it up, and carried it with him. Near the back, a hymnal had slipped from its rack and lay splayed on the floor. He picked it up, smoothed its pages, and slid it back into place. They were small gestures, almost meaningless. But for Leo, they were everything. As he reached the door, he remembered something. He walked back down the aisle to the small alcove of votive candles. Lying on the floor was a single flower, a white carnation that had fallen from a memorial bouquet. It was wilted and bruised. He picked it up, carried it to the main altar, and placed it gently on the bottom step. It was a pathetic offering. It was all he had. The ripples of that night spread in quiet, unseen ways. Arthur, the man who had been sleeping in the back pew, woke later that morning to find a heavy iron crowbar lying on the floor. His first instinct was to take it to the scrapyard on Gratiot. It would be worth a few dollars, enough for a hot meal. But something stopped him. He thought of the noise in the night, the clatter, the fleeing footsteps. He picked up the tool, found the church custodian, and handed it to him. "Someone left this," he said, and walked away without another word. The custodian, a man named George, simply nodded and took it, a silent understanding passing between them. Eleanor, the woman who had seen the light from her apartment window, felt a strange pull. She hadn't been to Mass in 20 years, not since her husband died. But that morning, she put on her best coat, crossed the street, and slipped into a pew at St. Joseph's Oratory. She didn't know why she was there, but as the priest raised the host, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the first she'd felt in decades. When the collection basket came around, she put in a $20 bill, into the very box Leo had come to empty. A week later, the waitress from Lafayette, Coney Island was on her break, smoking a cigarette on the curb. She saw a man sweeping the sidewalk a block down, in front of the old church. She recognized him, the haunted-looking man from the other night. But he looked different now. The desperate, frantic energy was gone, replaced by a calm focus. He was still thin, still wore the same worn coat, but his shoulders were less slumped. On an impulse, she went back inside, poured a coffee into a to-go cup, and grabbed a Coney dog. She walked down and handed it to him. He looked up, surprised. "You look like you needed this," she said. Leo took it, his eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. He just nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in a year. Father Michael had watched Leo from a distance. He'd seen him show up every morning, picking up trash, straightening books, pulling weeds from the frozen ground in the small church garden. He never asked for anything. One afternoon, the priest found him carefully tending to a single stubborn rose bush that had somehow survived the first frosts. Father Michael came and stood beside him. He didn't ask about the crowbar George had found. He didn't ask what had happened that night. He simply looked at the care with which Leo worked the soil and asked, "Do you know anything about gardening?" Leo looked up, his hands covered in dirt. "No, Father," he said, "but I'm learning." Leo's new mission was not proclaimed with trumpets or announced from the pulpit. It was a quiet, daily accumulation of small acts of service. Father Michael offered him a small, unused room in the back of the rectory, and Leo accepted. His life found a new rhythm, one dictated not by a factory whistle, but by the needs of the old church. He swept the floors, polished the brass candle holders, replaced burned-out light bulbs, and learned the names of the parish's faithful, elderly women who brought him cookies and called him a blessing. He found his purpose not in some grand calling, but in the humble, repetitive work of caring for the place he had once intended to violate. He was mending the house of God, and in doing so, mending himself. His presence became a quiet fixture, a symbol of redemption that no one spoke of, but everyone understood. One evening, he was locking the main doors when he saw a teenager with a can of spray paint tagging the stone wall near the entrance. The old Leo might have felt a flash of rage, or more likely, would have ignored it and walked away. The new Leo simply walked over. He didn't shout. He just stood there until the boy, startled, stopped and looked at him. "That's a beautiful color," Leo said, his voice calm, "but I don't think it belongs here." The boy, braced for a confrontation, was disarmed. Leo sat on the steps and pulled a sandwich from his coat pocket, breaking it in half and offering one to the boy. They ate in silence for a moment. Then Leo said, "This place saved my life. It has room for you too." The next day, the boy returned without the spray paint. He had a bucket and a brush, and together he and Leo scrubbed the wall clean. True grace is not found in what we can take, but in what we are given when we have nothing left. It is a voice that doesn't shout over the noise of the world, but waits for the deep, desperate silence of a broken heart to make itself heard. Leo went to a church, looking for something to fill his pockets, and left with something that would fill his soul. His story is a testament that no one is beyond redemption, and that the light shines brightest not when our lives are perfect, but when we are lost in the most profound darkness. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.